Welcome to the Revenue Builders Podcast, a weekly show featuring B2B sales leaders and executives. Hosted by five-time CRO John McMahon and Force Management co-founder John Kaplan, the show goes behind the scenes with the people who have been there, done that, and seen the results. If you enjoy our content, please subscribe, rate, and review the show to help us reach more people. Revenue Builders is brought to you by Force Management. We help companies improve sales performance, executing the growth strategy at the point of sale. Find us at forcemanagement.com. Enjoy today's episode.
So, George, this is your fifth time as a startup CRO. And we talked a little bit beforehand, and you've seen some commonality in these startups that you've joined where they grow essentially without implementing any processes for a certain time frame. But then as they scale further, the need for process becomes really visible and almost mandatory. So talk to us a little bit about that, what you've seen and when you think processes are mandatory.
Yeah, great question, John. So, in every place that I've gone, it seems like the challenges are consistent. And what it comes down to, right out of the gate is companies mature to a certain size. And then maybe I shouldn't use the word hit a wall, but they're not growing at the rate they'd like to grow. And they start to dig into, hey, do we have the right ICP? Are we marketing? Is our marketing effective? Are they focused on in that right ICP? And those things are put into place and executed on, but still the scale of the business isn't happening. And then they start to evaluate, the CEO starts to evaluate, and talking to his board, what really is not working? And some very veteran VCs start to recognize, hey, maybe the sales organization isn't disciplined in how they execute. And so they start to evaluate CROs that have scaled companies before, and that's typically when I get pulled in. And what the commonality is the first thing is they've hired salespeople that based on maybe not the ideal hiring profile. They've gone, and you and I have talked about this in past lives, John. They've gone down the path of, my gut says I should hire this individual. They passed the beer test, whatever term you want to use, but not really evaluating the things that they need to evaluate. They focus on the learned evaluations versus the innate skill set, the innate ability of individuals. So digging into innate ability, the analytical IQ, the emotional EQ, the persistence, the heart, the desire, all those things, those are attributes that salespeople must have. And then all the learned skills are value add. But without those innate abilities, it becomes somewhat of a challenge. So the first thing is, do I have the right hiring profile? Do I have the right people on the bus executing in the direction we need to go? Then the second thing that I've typically seen is the expectation is that sellers learn through osmosis, that they listen to their counterparts, and that's a little harder when everybody's remote. So they listen to their counterparts, or the sales manager connects them with their best salesperson, and they're hoping that, they learn from there. There's no formal enablement program in place to enable the existing sales organization to execute, let alone all the new hires you bring in, to ensure that they understand how to effectively sell the solution you're trying to sell. Not necessarily just knowing how to sell, but how to effectively sell what it is you want them to sell. So that's the second thing that typically I don't see exist. Then the third thing is all the KPIs and metrics that salespeople can evaluate for themselves. Are they on that trajectory for success? Or do I have more work to do? Do I have to try harder in sourcing more opportunities? Do I have to work more diligently with marketing to source more opportunities, my BDR, or what have you? But understanding what are the leading and lagging indicators of success are, and having them self-assess if they're on that path. And then lastly, it's really that thing that, PTC founded for all places, is that operating rhythm that drives an organization to that no excuses accountable culture So we all understand in sales what we're supposed to do and understand how we get there and are actually executing against it. So those are the four primary things that I've found in the 5 times that I've done this, that I need to put in place relatively quickly to get the momentum moving.
Yeah. One of the things that strikes me, and maybe it's built into the four things that you mentioned, and we should go back and talk about each one of the four. But when I've gone into some companies and they've invited me to, let's say, a QBR, all of a sudden I hear these words that are thrown around, and it's a thriving startup. They're growing like 100% a year. But then I'll start to ask. So I hear champion, gatekeeper, recommender, buyer, all these words. So then I stand up and say, hey, it's my first time here, just so we're all on the same page. Can you explain to me what the definition of, let's say, a champion is or a gatekeeper? And it's amazing how if you ask 3 or 4 people, you get 3 or 4 different answers. So it's built in, I think, to some of the things you're talking about, George. But people are literally speaking past each other because they're using a different definition for the same terminology. I
Yeah.
don't know if you've experienced that when you've jumped into some of these startups.
Oh, absolutely. And they use buzzwords, the idea of a champion, and they've even used terms like economic buyer. And they can, in a lot of instances, I'm not insinuating everybody makes these mistakes, but in a lot of instances, they confuse champion with coach. They confuse economic buyer with budget holder. So a common language and common definitions become so critical as part of the enablement. I just had a sales kickoff last week and took them through, MedPIC and what the definitions are and what a champion really is and what they are not. So a common language, even around the sales cycle, where you think about when somebody says this is a stage 1 opportunity or a stage 3 or 5, what have you. Like, what does that mean? So it's that common understanding. When I say we're in paper process, you know exactly what I'm saying. And so there's no confusion as to how we talk. So a common language absolutely is utmost in criticality.
So let's go back and break down some of these. So ideal hiring profile. So what happens a lot of times in startups is they might hire some people that are more uh, people that are just they're deal makers. They just in the early days you just need deals, so they hire these deal makers, and a lot of times those people don't scale or they don't want to adhere to any type of process. And let's be upfront. Like startups don't need a lot of bureaucracy, and when we're talking about adding process, we don't mean bureaucracy. We're balancing, process with making sure that it's flexible enough but putting some structure in place that, what's happening and when something goes wrong, what dial to turn to fix it. That's really what we're talking about.
That's right.
But so then you probably saw that they start to add some of their friends that came in from other companies. But to your point, they haven't nailed down for the persona that we're calling on, for the use case that we handle, and all of those attributes of the sales process. Is this person a good fit for our sales process at this stage of our company? That's really what you mean, right, George?
Absolutely. Let me give you a great real world example.
Love it.
Um, so in a maturity of an organization, at different stages, as you said, from 0 to 10 million, you need that entrepreneurial thinker, one that's creative, that will work with the engineering department, try to customize the solution to meet the requirements of that opportunity. But clearly, to get revenue in the door, that's fine early on, but that's not repeatable. That's not scalable, and it's extremely costly. And then you become a development organization for whoever you're selling to. So not an ideal scenario. So as you get beyond that 10 million, you start to think about more people that know how to ideally find their own opportunities, because marketing can only bring in so much based on the size of the organization, unless you're wildly scaling. And most companies I go into, that's not happening. You have to kind of build that outbound motion. So to start creating those types of opportunities for yourself and to know how to properly execute. So I've gone into a company that was in a space that is a mature space. It has existed since the late 90s, and now there's been the evolution of the technology and it's changed dramatically, but the idea of that space has existed for a long time. And their hiring practices were, I'm going to hire people that come from that space and put them in my organization so they know how to sell the solution. The challenge is, they put them in territories, and pretty much these territories were greenfield. There were no customers, but yet they came from the space, but they came from a situation where they managed 2 or 3 accounts. And their goal was to try to ferret out new opportunities within those 2 or 3 accounts to scale the business, to grow the revenue in those 2 or 3 accounts. Now you put that DNA type into a hunting territory, if you will, a new logo territory, where you're asking them to break down doors and get into new opportunities. That is not a fit. No matter how well they understand what it is you do in the market and the competition, that's not their DNA, and they don't typically do well in that world.
Right. They have knowledge of the game, but they don't have the skill set, is what you're saying. My analogy is always like Tom Brady may go down as the greatest quarterback of all time. His knowledge of the game is superior. He studies film or studied film, hours and hours a day. Now, so no one can disagree that Tom's knowledge of the game is exceptional. You might debate it, but for the most part, people won't argue it too much. Now, put Tom in any other position on the field, and on the first play, you'll say, what is he doing over there? And that's exactly what you're talking about. These people might have knowledge of the product and the use case, but now you put them in a territory where they need a skill set to be able to open up doors, weave their way through the politics, find the right person, ask the right discovery questions, and ferret out the need for the product. They don't have that skill set.
That's right. And in a lot of instances, if you also bring them from large organizations where that flywheel of momentum has already started, and they're good at fulfilling established demand, and you're asking to do a lot more in breaking into opportunities and ferreting out new logos and new opportunities within those new logos. Even when you break down that door, you have to create opportunities versus fulfill demand created by the account.
Yeah, you're talking about basically in a lot of startups, if the company has never bought this product before, they don't have a budget for it. So they also have, these people have to know how to create a good cost justification and essentially steal budget off the existing budget. And if they can't steal budget, they don't have that skill set to go out there and go grab new logos.
Yeah. And as you know, discipline and understanding how to properly execute a sales campaign, from doing proper discovery, where it's not only what are you trying to accomplish, but truly mapping it to the needs of the organization, commonly called the business pain, right? Teaching people how to effectively do that and understanding what are the requirements of the technology to address that business pain. And if we address that business pain, what's the positive outcome that would come of that? And then how do you do discovery where you're leading the prospect down the path of your unique value, your unique differentiation, versus just being happy to be there and being followed by, following what the customer is driving you to do versus leading the customer. Because we do this every day. They do it 2 or 3 times in their lifetime.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
I think that the concept that we're talking about here in the hiring profile, a point that I just want to make sure we nail here is that it is fluid. And what I mean by that is in the early stages of companies, it is very difficult to create a hiring profile that you're going to have for the rest of the stages of growth. And I say it's impossible. And what I mean by that is like you guys have been discussing, if you don't have an ICP and you don't have a value proposition, problems we solve, how we solve them differently or better, where we've done it before, and we don't have an understanding of how the buyer buys, and based upon how the buyer buys, who's doing what when in an engagement model, then that's a completely different profile of an individual. Johnny, you and I have talked about in the early stages, many times you have these domain expertise or domain experts that wind up really kind of helping you get a product market fit. And almost 100% of those at the time, as you scale that company, which is very difficult to scale a company that way. So now you have to tweak that profile and be able to give them the knowledge and the skills and the culture of a sales organization. So you can now go hire hunters who, if you can give them that information, they don't need to learn how to pull the trigger. They can shoot the bear between the eyes. But you got to tell them where the bear eats, how the bear sleeps, when the bear sleeps, where the bear goes, and they're all set. But I find a lot of people, they say, hey, people's the most important thing. And I agree, people is extremely important. And in the early stages of company, they try to nail a profile and they think that that's going to be the profile that's going to take them into the growth stages of, as you said, George, the flywheel. And it's absolutely not.
Yeah. Look, it is, you're always assessing. It never ends as to the requirements that you need and the kind of individual or DNA, maybe is a different way to say it, that you need. And over the evolution, in one organization, we started to establish meaningful accounts where they were in the global 100, large transactions that we did in those accounts. So then at that point, you start having two different hiring profiles, right? Initially, one that's focused on the care and feeding of these global accounts, and they become these global account managers and are managing individuals in different geographies to support them to, get deeper and wider in these accounts. And then you still have the other DNA that you're going to throw them in that territory and say, go break down those walls and let's win some new logos. So it's just a constant evolution as you scale the business. But also be mindful that depending on the kind of business, the example I just gave you was large enterprise, and that organization focused on that demographic of accounts. The organization I'm with now is high volume, high transaction. We'll do over 1,000 transactions in a quarter. That's a much different hiring profile. You hire a rep that is used to doing 3-4 transactions, even up to 8 to 10 in a year, and put them in this kind of environment or vice versa. That doesn't go well.
No, it's rate and pace.
Yeah. Let's follow up on this point because I love this. What the mistake people make when you dig in on this profile and you start to evolve, like you're talking about, George, many times companies and hiring managers they fool themselves and say, this person can obviously do this. They've done it before. They can obviously do it. They answered great questions when they know how to do it during the interview. But if you don't get down to the next level of questioning, does it give them energy? Meaning, it's not whether or not somebody can do something always. The next level of validation or qualification is it going to give them energy? And I've seen companies make mistakes that say, oh, we'll hire Kaplan. He's got a long history of doing this in the past. And they say in the past, but how long ago? Can he do it? Yes, he can do it. Does he want to do it? Is it going to give him energy? Is it going to get him up, swing his legs over the side of the bed?
And that's the same that George is talking about too. You can also take inside your company a territory rep and jam them into a major account rep, and they may not get the energy. That may not be their skill set. And they may think, I got to check out, or vice versa. You take somebody that loves to call on just 2 or 3 accounts, jam them in territory with a high rate and pace, and you're going to lose them. They can do it, to your point, but do they really want to do it because they get energy from it? No.
Right. It's a must to get to that level in asking your questions. Johnny, you're always talking about getting intimate with your folks. And if you don't get to that level of understanding what gives the people energy, you might make that mistake. Because I actually made a mistake one time where I had somebody quit on me and was killing their number. And when they came in to do an exit interview, they said to me, I said, why are you quitting? Why are you quitting? You're fantastic at what you do. And they're like, yeah, I kind of had a feeling we were going to have this conversation. I don't like doing this. And I'm like, what do you mean you don't like it? You're killing it. He said, yeah, again, I knew this conversation was going to go that way. I might be killing it in your eyes, but I absolutely hate the job. And that is how I learned this conversation about energy. I only had to learn that once.
I want to switch gears just a little bit now. We're talking about the ideal, hiring profile. But now, George, you've seen this movie too. Company goes from, 10 to 20. And they needed, let's say on average productivity per rep, they needed, to make the numbers easy, they needed 10 reps. Then they go 20 to 40, they only need 20 reps. Now they're going to go 40 to 80. Now they need 40 reps. If you don't have your sourcing down, your recruiting process down, the paperwork, even through HR and back out to the candidate, and then how to onboard them and make sure that they're ready day one and have all the tools that they need. If you don't have that process down, you're not going to go from 40 to 80. You're probably going to go from 40 to 60 because you just didn't have your sourcing and recruiting process down.
Yeah, there's so much, there's a lot of the work that I believe hiring managers, CROs included, is I spend a lot of time with our recruiting folks. Now, in past lives, we used external recruiters. In the last few, they're internal recruiters, but it doesn't matter. It's what is the ideal hiring profile that we're looking for at this time, and actually spending the time with the recruiting manager so they understand what to look for and not waste time. But in that whole process is, look, I would always argue, and I always tell CROs, look, don't hire me if you're not willing to invest in these resources. One is a great sales ops person, and the other, a great sales enablement person in conjunction with my role, because the three of us are what's going to make this thing go. So the onboarding, once obviously you figured out what is the ideal hiring profile for the time, the place that the company is at, you resource those candidates, you've done all your diligence, you've inspected all the things, you've asked the second and third line questions. Like, we always want people that not geniuses, but above average capability, right? So, I always ask hiring managers, well, how do you assess for that? How do you inspect for that? How do you inspect for work ethic? How do you inspect for discipline? What is it that you would ask to ferret out that actually all exists? And again, it's instinctual versus it's based on some factual data that they were able to contrive. So once you hire this individual, then the onboarding becomes so critical, whether you do, we do quarterly new hires, right? So sometimes if you started early in the quarter, you might have to wait a couple of months before you come to new hire class. But quarterly new hires where they come in, they have pre-work that they must do, that probably about 10 hours of pre-work before they even attend new hire. They have to test into new hire to show that they did the pre-work. And obviously there's online testing that comes into place. And then what you do is, you kind of preload these individuals to be successful. And once they get on site, then you focus on the nuances of ensuring they can execute and do their job. So we do a lot of work around the sales stages and best practices around the sales stages. So we start with, how do you effectively prospect? you'd be amazed at the reps really not knowing how to exactly leverage the common tools that we have today with leveraging AI. How do I put those into practice to help me do what I do? It's amazing the tools that, I remember way back when, and it's always terrible when you tell the reps to start. I don't know, back in my day, prospecting was I'd go through the want ads, rip out companies who were looking for IT folks, then I assumed they needed networking equipment and I'd make a cold call. But today with the Zoom infos of the world and other technologies, you can get a background on the company, their initiatives. AI can write you an email, something compelling to the appropriate buying persona, hit click and send. So how
This is that osmosis. This is that osmosis you're talking about. It's not osmosis.
No, it's learned.
What are the critical activities in each of the stages? And I love how you just broke it down. You're like, we're going to take the stages that you're going to go through to align to the way that your buyer buys, and we're going to help develop you on the critical activities that you're going to do. We're not just going to assume that you're going to get it through osmosis. That's a great point.
I always use the analogy with sales managers because they'll tell me, "Hey, look, my job is to get stuff. I hire great people, and my job is to get stuff out of their way so they can execute." And I always throw back, and I'll use your Tom Brady analogy, John. I go, "Okay, let me ask you something. When Tom Brady and Bill Belichick were partnered on the Patriots, you think Bill Belichick told Tom Brady, 'Hey, you're a GOAT. You're the greatest of all time. Just show up on Sunday and win the game. There's nothing else you need to do. Just show up on Sunday and win the game.'" Or is he expecting him to practice every day, stay after hours with his receivers, watch game film to no end every day so he knows all the nuances of the defenses that he's going to be playing against and can visually see it on the field and execute effectively? Which option do you think Bill Belichick is going with? Tom, just show up on Sunday and win the game? Or am I going to work Tom Brady to death to make sure he's ready for the game? You telling me that, hey, I'm just going to, I hire great people and I just take obstacles out of their way and I let them execute. You're kind of taking, show up on Sunday and win the game. Now, how
we had Pepper Johnson. We had Pepper Johnson on a Revenue Builders a couple years ago. If you haven't heard that, it's just a hoot where he talks about Belichick and Brady as he was coaching for the Patriots. But I want to hone in on a point you said there. Those two spent hours together every day. And as a matter of fact, there used to be a rule that said you can't leave the facility unless all the players are gone. And then they came up with the Tom Brady and Bill Belichick rule that said if those are the only two cars that are there, you guys can go home to your families because they're going to be there all night.
Yeah, because Brady's car was always there. Yeah.
Yeah.
If you think about it,
but your point is they're working together intimately on what it's going to take for that week, for that deal, for that scenario, for that account. And it's not just getting things out. Tom, are you getting the sleep that you need? Are you getting bothered by anybody of the reporters? They weren't just moving obstacles out of the way, like to your point.
Yeah. If you think about, so we bring them to new hire and we teach them how to prospect, how to do proper discovery, qualification, how to effectively do the technical validation phase, negotiation to close. But, the argument that I always tell sellers, I'm like, yeah, you ever watch professional teams? They practice 90% of the time, they play 10% of the time. We do the opposite, right? Salespeople practice in front of customers. And what we're trying to do is minimize your practice in front of a critical opportunity. You practice here, fail here, it's okay. Nobody's going to judge you. We're just going to get better. And then, go execute when it's game time. So a lot of we do this, once a quarter, come in for new hire. And these are for the new hires, but we do weekly enablement, every week. And it's on some topic, whether, hey, a rep found a great opportunity to talk about how they found it, and then the process they went through to execute and close it, whether it's on negotiation, whatever it is. But it's that ongoing enablement to ensure that our reps are the best that they can be when executing in front of customers. That's just, as I said earlier, First one is having the right people. Second one is the enablement. And that's just an ongoing cadence. It's not a moment in time. It's not, hey, I read John McMahon's book and it's phenomenal. We're going to go do this. And then momentum, they do it for a few months and then the CRO loses interest and it wanes off and it's not part of their daily discipline. You have to embed everything you do is part of your daily communication. So if you're going to really leverage MedPick, it's how you talk to people every day. It's not a moment in time thing. When you go through your forecast, first question is, what's the pain? And then work your way through the metric and on through the other letters.
Well, what you guys were both talking about earlier when you talked about, and I don't want to skip ahead, but it's related. When you have an enablement team, an enablement focus, and you're focused on helping people do their job at critical stages of deal development and buyer maturity as they make their decision, you're also looking at KPIs. And it doesn't take you long to figure out where people are getting stuck, where people are going to need help. I find people that have the greatest access to information and measurement on what the people are doing every day know how to get them unstuck. So you're bringing those two worlds together. How have you seen that, George? It's not like you put together a development plan at the beginning of the year. You might that says, hey, these are the 5 things we want to do this year. But you're constantly evolving as it relates to changes in the marketplace, new competitors, people are getting stuck, deal sizes are getting a little. Give us some examples of how you use that.
Yeah. So, the tools that we leverage, whether they're AI, whether it's, deal qualification tools like MedPick, whether it's, account reviews, deal plans, and what have you, they're all kind of pointers as to what's happening. They're all leading indicators as to what you should be doing in that opportunity. To me, the argument that I use with people on leveraging a deal qualification tool, whether you want to use MedPick or some other tool, I'm not insinuating that that's the best thing on the planet, but it's the language we're going to use. And it's a common language, so that's what we're going to use. But if you go through it and you truly are disciplined about it and don't make up the answers, where a lot people make up the answers to some extent to try to make themselves feel better that they have addressed whatever letter that they're on, so that happens, or they want to look good in front of their boss or what have you. When you're intellectually honest with yourself, when you're alone by yourself and you're assessing your opportunity, leveraging a tool like that, and noticing where your gaps are at, nobody else has to, just you noticing where your gaps are at, that sets forth a plan as to what you need to do to address those gaps. And that's the beauty of leveraging these types of technologies, tools, and what have you. They point you in that direction of what you should be doing, whether it's territory planning, account planning, deal reviews, look at pipeline. If you think about the ratios that everybody uses the comment, I need 3x. Well, do you? It's based on, well, what's your conversion rates, right?
Right. You could have 3x or 5, 10x, but if it's all in the lead stage, it's not converting. Right.
Exactly. Dead on. So, to use these like, I measured a 3x. Well, come on now. Let's think through what you're really saying. That just seems like a learned answer. So, it's understanding all the metrics of the business to where different segments, like we have a strategic team, we have a commercial team that does, smaller companies. We have an expansion teams that upsell existing accounts. The metrics for all those are different. You can't use a generic metric across all those to know what you need to have to be successful. So you have to figure out what all those details are, all those metrics are, so everybody knows what they're marching towards. Because obviously selling into an install base account, your conversion rates tend to be higher. Selling into a new logo, your conversion rates tend to be lower. Do they need the same ratios? Absolutely not. And then, because we are a high volume business, you source and close in quarter. So you kind of have to also include that as part of if you tell a team that you have a 2x, you have to enter the quarter with 2 times your quarterly quota because you know that they're going to source and close an additional 2x in the quarter. So you have to incorporate all those nuances around your business. It's not just generic, I need a 3x. It doesn't work like that.
No, I agree. And the other reason is, your CEO requires those types of metrics. The board requires those types of metrics. Any VCs that are going to, invest in your business in future funding rounds, they expect that you have those metrics. So that's why and you can't have those metrics if you don't have any processes in place.
That's right. It comes down to, and this is always something interesting. You walk into a company and you see the pipeline, and you're like, why aren't you making your numbers if your pipeline is that large?
Right.
Just simple things, guys, like what defines a pipeline opportunity? What says a deal can be part of the pipeline or is not part of the pipeline? The thing I always say is like, there's a project, there's a timeline, they have access to funds, we know who the competitors are, and we have a viable solution to address their needs. Just at a basic level, at that high level, that says, I have a real deal. That thing is actually a project that they're executing on. There's a timeline for it, and they're looking at other vendors and us. So that to me defines a pipeline opportunity. So are we measuring our pipeline ratios against that, or are we measuring the pipeline ratios against people that showed interest, but there's no project?
Let's also look at timeframes here. Johnny, I've heard you talk about, and I'd like you to refer to it again, and then George, I'd like you to comment on it. You talk about this concept of a 5-quarter report and timing out, looking at 5 quarters. What do you mean by that? And then George, based upon that, give us your feedback on how that might change in the different types of business, land and expand or enterprise. Johnny, what do you
have a
mean by
5-quarter report typically shows the results for the last 4 quarters and then what you're forecasting for this quarter. And it can be broken down, to George's point, by, let's say, enterprise sales, commercial sales, SDRs. You can break it down by group, but you're looking at the key metrics and how they've performed over the course of the last 4 quarters, and then what you're forecasting this quarter. So number of new logos, number of upsell deals, average sales price, those types of metrics, deal cycle times, all of those things. And then because it's a 5-quarter report, you start to see trends that are starting to happen. Let's say your ASP is all of a sudden dropping off and your sales cycles are getting extended. Something's going on. And as the CRO, you need to jump in and figure out, are they discounting? Why are my sales cycles getting longer? Why can't, and why is my ASP dropping? Do I not have enough pipeline so the people are kind of jumping on deals and discounting just to make the numbers. So I've always thought that a 5-quarter report really, as you always say sometimes, Johnny, that trend could be your friend, or sometimes that trend could be your enemy, and you have to jump in and figure out what's going right or wrong.
Yeah. And the 5-year also allows you to do year-over-year comparisons, right?
Yeah, year-over-year and quarter-over-quarter, right? Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, so
but all of this goes back to what George is talking about. If you don't have things nailed down into a process, whether that's a sales process, qualification process, pipeline process, recruiting process, how many heads are we recruiting? How many are on board? How many are in process? If you don't have all those metrics because you haven't broken down your process, it's really hard to figure out, why am I failing and where to look.
Yeah.
You can't have trends if you don't have common language and common metrics. You don't know what's a trend or not.
Yeah.
But on additional value to that I've seen is when you implement these disciplines, I'll call them disciplines and processes as to how the sales organization is going to execute. As I said earlier, when you enter an organization that needs this type of discipline, because it's reached a point of maturity where for it to continue to scale at the rate it wants to scale, it's critical that these best practices are put in place. But what I would also say is, sure, sales is at the tip of the spear and must execute to help accelerate the organization's growth. But when typically you enter and you realize that these are all the things that need to get addressed within the sales organization, let's not get confused. They probably exist in all other departments in the company.
Yeah.
Whether it's marketing, whether it's product, whether it's engineering, all the other stakeholders within the company. So a second outcome of implementing these types of disciplines and accountability is it helps pull the rest of the company along because they see what's happening on the sales side and ensuring that the things they expect to see from a sales organization around execution and discipline and accountability, you start to expect that of them because you invite them to your QBRs, you invite them to your forecast calls and whatever other calls that you have with your organization, in the hopes that they start to see that these things are important in their own departments and start to implement. Obviously, they're not the same exact disciplines, but that whole accountability culture throughout the organization, not just in sales. It's hard for salespeople to win if not everybody in the company is rowing in the right direction. I think Frank Slootman from ServiceNow, Snowflake fame, and others said you can have success with a great sales organization and an okay product, but you will have great success with a great product well executed against. Right?
Yeah, then you have a double barrel shotgun. Yeah.
You bet. And so it's trying to ensure that the other barrel is going to fire effectively.
Yeah. Well, I think that's even like, in small companies as they're growing fast and even as they start to scale, just that whole enhancement process where sales reps go out and they say, hey, we need this enhancement in order to compete. How does that fit into development? What is the process for them to prioritize all the enhancements that they need for the product to maintain your existing competitive differentiators or to create a new competitive differentiator, right? What is that process? That's a whole process, like you said, George, where you have to pull in product and you pull in development into that process on a regular basis. Make sure they're getting the right customer feedback and the right sales feedback.
That's right. And the role, I've always looked at the role of the CRO is to build those intimate relationships with the counterparts within the company, product, marketing, engineering. So there's trust built and they hear you more effectively, right? Because you've engaged with them, you've invited them into your house, if you will, and everything that you're doing. And in turn, that builds that rapport and they're much more willing to entertain. Because look, in a lot of departments, they feel like sales is overly babied sometimes and get everything they want. So you want them to put the salesperson's shoes on and understand the challenges that they go through every day. So the things that we're asking for, they recognize are not a one-off. These are the things that are going to keep us relevant, more competitive in the market and allow us to win.
Yeah, I think you bring up a really good point because as a company grows, the role of the CRO really changes. The CRO now becomes the most pulled on person on the executive team, even more than the CEO. Everybody wants a piece of the CRO. The CEO wants a piece of them. Chief financial officer wants a piece. Chief product officer, marketing, they all want on and on. They all want a piece of the CRO. And that CRO has to have that executive team mentality that I am going to be an integral part of this team. And I have seen it where companies are growing pretty fast, but the CRO doesn't buy into being an intimate, an engaging partner on the executive team. And, I've seen them have to get cut loose because of that alone.
Yeah, your job, as you said, John, your job matures into more than just running sales. You become the glue, I believe, in the organization, because everything the organization is about executing and bringing in more dollars in the door, and you become the conduit with the different departments to ensure that that continues to happen. I believe that it becomes more critical in your role as the company evolves and scales.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree. I think it goes both ways too. I mean, you think about that famous thing that you see on law enforcement badges where it says protect and serve. And I think where CROs get in trouble sometimes is where they don't protect the company. And what I mean by that is you have a customer that is you have a very well-defined ICP. You've done a big deal, or that customer is trying to get enhancements, and they're doing things or asking things of the company that it may or may not be a good thing for the company to do. And you've got to mitigate that. As a CRO, you have to be in the middle of that to really, because if not, then the product people are going to get frustrated and the product marketing people are going to get frustrated. I call it's kind of like protecting the 100-pound brains in the company. And if you get them focused on the things like, hey, we've got this feature enhancement, where it goes the other way, when you're serving the organization, you're serving the sales organization, just tell me, with this feature, what problems are you going to solve for the customer? How specifically will it do it? How, as Johnny said, how will it do it differently or better as it relates to differentiation for our customers? And are we going to stand this customer up as a proof point, a case study, or a testimonial? That goes both ways. And I find that, like both of you just said, CROs have to have their head on a swivel. They've got to be protecting and serving, serving customers and sellers, and protecting the company. And it's sometimes they don't do both, and they're not very good at both, and they don't make it.
John, that's a great analogy. I'm going to use that if you don't mind.
Take it, brother.
Well, the other part of it too, George, is what you brought up when we first started this, is in order to pull people in and get them to understand when they can be involved and when they should be involved, especially since, in a quarter you have 90 days, but essentially you have around 62, real working days. You have to have an operating rhythm that says, this is what we do in the first 10 days of a quarter. This is what we do in the last 10 days of a quarter. I've experienced it where, a head of development was coming after me in the last week of a quarter, and I kept ignoring him. And he got mad and came in my office and started yelling at me, "Why are you ignoring me?" And I had to explain to him, let me show you my operating rhythm. And it was my fault for not sharing it with him earlier, that in the last week of a quarter, I'm just shut down on everything but closing deals.
Right.
But once I shared it with him, he understood. And there he showed up at my desk, 5 days into the next quarter.
Yeah, and that operating rhythm, the why it's really important, because our operating rhythm is, week one in any quarter is the rep QBR, second week is management QBRs, the routine.
Yeah, I know the routine.
Then week fives, week nines, and then every week starting week 3 through week 12, we do some form of enablement. We have weekly sales operational calls. So it's an operating rhythm. And the importance of that is not just managing the business, it's everybody knows what to expect. All the salespeople know what they expect. They know the questions that are going to come out.
They know when things are due, when the forecast is due, when the pipeline review is due, when the QBR is, when we do the training, all those things.
That's right. That's right. And as accountable as one needs to be, there's also a level of comfort in understanding what's coming, right? And never being caught. No one should say in a sales organization, "Oh, I didn't know that was going to happen," or "I didn't know that question was going to come about," and what have you.
Yeah, or "I didn't know I was supposed to send this, information to you by the 10th of the month."
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
George, go ahead, Johnny.
Well, just one of the things I was thinking about is, just like in athletics, I remember in college, with all the anxiety of getting ready for a game. So we're practicing and then it's game time. And I have to tell you, one of the most comforting things for me was to come into the locker room on game day and look up at the whiteboard and absolutely understand what was going to happen by minute in pregame. You needed to be dressed and on the taped and ready to go at this time. You needed to be, because without that, with all the emotions running high as you're getting ready to play that game, I actually kind of missed that in life. And it helped me think about it later on as a leader, is that operating rhythm becomes very comforting, provided that operating rhythm leads you to victories. People, everybody's willing to be led, provided you can take them to a place they can't get to on their own. And I miss going into that locker room before a game and for them actually telling me when I'm supposed to stretch, when I'm supposed to be hydrated. And, today it's completely, they go, 3 or 4 days back and they're telling them what kind of sleep they need, what they should be eating beforehand. And when you're playing for an organization, let's translate it into business, that can break that down for you, provided it leads you to victories, everybody loves to be in that environment.
Yeah.
When are you stretching now, Cap? When do you stretch now?
Well, I'm stretching when I got home today, buddy, after shooting that 98. I'm stretching. Oh, you always got to do it to me, brother.
That was an unprovoked attack.
You always got to do it to me, George. Oh.
It's a rough crowd. It's a rough crowd.
Love it.
But hey, George, when you've gone into these organizations, how many times have you even seen that there's some sort of sales process in place, some sort of qualification methodology in place? Have you ever walked in and it's not even a sales process?
That's a kind of a nuanced question. Let me answer it.
Sure.
There's the sales process, but nobody understands it.
Wow. Yeah. Same thing. It's a communication thing, right? They different languages or different stages, but nobody knows exactly what to do. What's the exit criteria to go from one stage to the other? How do I know?
Or got put together by Enablement, and none of the sellers are using it, or none of the salespeople are using it.
Or you can say, in most places I've gone to, the people that have been there, specifically more I've typically brought in an enablement person, but the sales operations people are pretty strong.
Yeah.
So they have this stuff. It's just there isn't that ongoing discipline of ensuring people are adhering to it, that we're the ongoing enablement, so people are reminded of it. So it's not, when I say there is a process but nobody adheres to it, is because the sales operations folks are not being supported enough to ensure that the sellers are adhering to it and following best practices. So there's a sales process. It's maybe not the ideal one for that environment. Or there is a sales process and it is the ideal one, but nobody's adhering to it. They're just doing their own thing. The beauty of today's technology is you can listen. You know how we used to ask ourselves, how do we know what we're teaching people are actually adopting and using? You're not with them on the sales call. Yeah. You can't attend that many sales calls. But, at our company, we mandate that all calls are recorded. And with AI and technologies like Gong and others, you are on every sales call if you want to listen in or get the cliff notes. So you can see if people are adopting what you're teaching, and it helps you tweak and adjust areas you need to double down on, refocus on. So the tools of today are amazing in giving you direction as to what you need to do for your organization.
And I think the sales leaders have got to be just like my coaches were, to get you emotionally connected to a motion that led to success, and them listening to Gong and seeing somebody do a great job with discovery, seeing somebody do a great job with qualification, and then following up with that individual and getting them emotionally connected to, that's why we do all those role plays, or that's why we do all that such and such in the sales process. I find that great sales leaders today are also the ones that get people emotionally committed to, or emotionally connected to, the fundamentals that are leading to those outcomes. And it's not like rocket science, but it
works both ways.
Yeah.
I get emotionally connected to them when I hear them using the language we just taught.
Yeah.
I feel like that person's bought in and is committed to what it is we're trying to get to.
Love it.
So it works both ways.
Love it.
So, George, you walk into most of these organizations, and we're going to go back to the beginning now, but I want to see if we're leaving anything out. And you're saying that they mainly are missing an ideal hiring profile. They're missing formal onboarding and training. They're missing the KPIs, the right metrics, the leading and lagging indicators that can tell them, how they're doing. And they're missing an operating rhythm. And I think we also touched on heavily that all of this leads to there's a lot of miscommunication or definitions of words. And in many cases, you walk in and there's a sales process, but no one's really utilizing. There's no, as you said earlier, there's no discipline around any of these processes. Is there anything else that you normally see when you walk in?
The last one I would say is kind of like human inner, and this might come across as a little soft, but really it's important because, since that whole COVID thing and everybody working remote and not coming together, that, you have a sales kickoff and these people are meeting each other for the first time. And I remember, the thing that brought me a lot of joy early on in my sales career is actually taking a break and going to lunch with my peers and we became friends.
Yes.
That interconnectedness that, I bounced ideas like, how'd you get that done? And how'd you do this? And that was a great win. Tell me how you found that opportunity. That in this remote kind of environment, you as a CRO have to kind of bring people together. And, in the interview process that I have gone through, I think about, hey, it's not in these most recent companies, it's not a traditional enterprise where you plant people in geographies and they actually physically make sales calls and go visit the customer. Even though they call them strategic or enterprise, it's an inside sales call.
Okay.
Most of it. So why would you have people remote in that world? Why wouldn't you consolidate people so they can learn from each other, build camaraderie,
Right.
build friendships? And, you will get a quarter, the analysis I've read is you have 4 times higher churn when everybody's remote versus when people are together.
Wow.
I believe it.
So the thing is, like, people haven't thought through that cultural thing, where we try to bring people together, and the more they are together, the more they learn, the more
I've always thought, when you put everybody together, especially every quarter, that a lot of times you'll hear from the CEO and the CFO, oh, that's really expensive. But we're doing so much training across so many people and instilling discipline and processes like that's almost priceless. But what I found out at the end of the day is the priceless part comes from them all engaging together. They start to share success stories. They start to share practices of how they do things. And you can't put a number on that. You literally can't. That's even more powerful than all the formal training you did for 2 or 3 days during the QBR.
That's right.
That's what I found. So powerful.
Absolutely. That I couldn't agree more, especially in today's world.
Yeah.
There's one last point that I'd like to make that you guys both talked about in the beginning, and this is a pet peeve of mine right now. You talked about scaling an organization, and if you had to hire 20, 40, 60, 80. I think one of the things that gets underestimated is a company's ability to actually, sourcing and all that stuff, sourcing, interviewing, recruiting, onboarding. We talk about that a lot. What many CROs don't contemplate is I got to get everybody inside my company on the same page. Like, this is not a sales initiative to go out and hire 20 or 40 people. And I'm just hearing some horrific stories out there because I mentor a lot of sellers and frontline managers, and I'm walking them through interview process, some stuff. I'm like, hey, did you get any feedback on that interview? And they're like, no, like, they told me they killed the interview and they got great feedback. We're going to get back to you in a couple of days or whatever. And like companies don't realize they're a walking audition for what it's going to be like to work for them. Does that make sense? And I'm finding like things are driving me nuts. They're like, hey, I went out and I did my job and I recruited 4 people and I can't get a freaking offer letter out the door. It's taken me 2 or 3 or 4 weeks to get an offer letter out the door. And I just want to make that little point as we were talking about. That's the same thing as that CRO having a head on a swivel. They got to look internally also and make sure when the board turns on the floodgates, says we're going to go hire people, I want you to go hire 10, 15 people over the next 2 quarters or whatever it is. You got to go back to the company and say, giddy up. Like, we got to set those expectations for what's that going to be. Because when not, like I'm seeing companies that are starting, they open up a floodgate in November. I just talked to somebody yesterday. They opened up a floodgate in November. They've dragged their feet on saying when they're going to, open up the head recs and let people, and now they're supposed to be in seat and onboarded and ready to go, and they're going to miss another 90 days. And that's how you burn cash in an organization, as you guys well know. So I just wanted to make that point, heads up for a CRO. And then, George, if you have any heads up on that, have you ever had to go, okay, I get what everybody's telling me. Have you ever had to go look back inside the company and go, hey, we gotta do it right?
I'll give you, not in that situation, but I'll give you another example that we just did this. As I said, we have over 1,000 transactions in a quarter. And the bottleneck was the counter signature of contracts.
Same thing, same kind of thing.
Same thing, right?
Yes.
So the finance organization did a great job in automating the counter signature, right? To mitigate that delay. Because it's not so much how quickly we book the order, but a customer's renewal and their environment staying live is dependent on the execution of that order. If that order isn't in our systems executed at the proper time, which requires a counter signature, we can accidentally shut them off. Right? So it's so critical to ensure that the systems are in place to keep up with demand of what it is that we do.
Love it.
Yeah, but going back to Cap's point, people forget that they're competing against other companies for talent. And if your process from the time you engage a candidate to the time that you actually issue the, offer letter and they accept it, if that's too long, you lose candidates where there's a more efficient company that knows how to run through that process very quickly. And to your point, Cap, it used to be absolutely a pet peeve of mine. Any company that took too long to get an offer letter out told me everything I needed to know about the company. That's it.
Totally.
You take 4 days to get an offer letter out, I don't want to work for you.
Yeah.
In fact, when I used to get really good candidates and they came up to me and I was the last guy, if I had a really good candidate, I'd say, hold on a second. Do you mind? I got to go to the restroom. I didn't go to the restroom. I ran down to HR and said, generate an offer letter right now. Yeah. I'm going to try to get this guy to sign this thing right now.
Yeah. Great point.
Sometimes they'd say, I can't sign it right now. And I'd say, why not? Well, I got to talk to my wife. I go, great. Let's call her.
Blows them.
Oh, buddy.
If I could add one more thing, in scaling startups, whatever maturity level they're at, whether they're in the 20 to 50, 50 to 100 or whatever, at a certain point, maybe when you get a couple of 100 million, I can understand backing off of there, but I believe a CRO needs to interview everybody that's going to get hired in their organization.
Yes. Yeah. Otherwise, you wake up one day, you look at your team and go, "Uh-oh, I'm going to lose my job." It's only a matter of time now before we fail. Because look at this team that I got. This is not the team that I wanted. Right.
That's right. And that jarred when you said you walked down and got an offer letter out. It jarred in my head. Yeah. John is interviewing a sales rep. So that means John
for sure. Absolutely. I didn't want anyone on my team that I didn't take a look at.
Yeah,
for sure. The other thing that happens is as you get really big, George, to your point, let's say you have 20 first line managers. Let's say the productivity per rep is 1.2 million. So it's $100,000 a month. And you go around the room and find out that each one of these managers was late by only 1 month in recruiting. That all rolls up to you. So let's say it's 30 of them. You got a $3 million shortfall. And it's not maybe this quarter, but it's happened. If you have 6 months to productivity, 6 months from now, you got a $3 million shortfall coming your way, brother.
That's happening every day, Johnny.
Happens all the time.
Yep.
And the person that pays the penalties is the CRO. First line manager doesn't care that they were 1 month late. Second line manager doesn't really affect them. Third line manager, it's starting to affect. You start getting higher and higher, it really aggregates up to that level, and it's very damaging.
That's a great
point.
point.
And it's kind of like this hidden thing, because 6 months later, you're figuring out, like, why did we miss? And it went all the way back to 6 months ago. You were too slow in hiring.
Yeah. Yeah. I've done the math on the cost of a bad hire.
Well,
Really, it's 2 years worth of lost revenue.
Absolutely.
Totally.
But what you just said is a phenomenal point. That
Thank you. I try to make some point.
you just taught me something.
He needs that validation, George. You just made his day. He doesn't get it from me, brother.
I'm going to go stretch right now. I'm going to go stretch.
You must have pulled something golfing.
Yeah.
Oh, I pulled a lot of golfing, brother.
Mainly when we were trying to hit from out of the woods.
Oh,
Hurt yourself hitting a tree.
okay, buddy. Okay.
All right. Well, thank you, George. Thank
George,
you,
you
Cap.
killed it, dude.
Thanks
Thank
to
you.
everyone for listening to another episode of the Revenue Builders Podcast.
Thanks for listening to today's episode. Be sure to check us out at forcemanagement.com.